I realize what I'm going to say next may sound sacrilege, like sacrilege to some. But I think, looking back, I think it was a mistake to create a national holiday celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. I believe King was a revolutionary. A nonviolent revolution is what he led, but it was a revolution all the same. And when we allowed his name and his legacy to be usurped by the same system he was working to overturn, revolution, overturn, when we allow politicians to possess and control his message and to claim victory, when we put him on a pedestal and declared him a national hero instead of following his lead in the struggle, the revolution was put on hold. Consider that word, revolution. We're all familiar with the violent revolutions of the world, the violent revolution that gave birth to this country. And some think that revolution and war are synonymous. And of course, revolution is only a word used by the winning side, right? If the founders of this country had lost the war, it would have been called the American Rebellion, not the American Revolution. And really, there was nothing revolutionary about the war. Rebellion was not new. Wars of revolution were not new. The revolution came after the war. The true turning of the American Revolution came when the leaders of the violence did not turn that victory back on the people. They did not use the violence to create a platform to assert power for themselves. That was the revolution. It was a revolution of ideas. So instead of taking power for themselves, they turned around and tried to create a government based on some truly revolutionary ideas. And they weren't perfect, far from it. But the very fact that we did not end up with another king or emperor in charge was the victory. Now, I don't think Martin Luther King Jr. started out as a revolutionary. I don't think that was his initial goal. I think he started out as a reformer. And a reformer doesn't want to overturn the status quo, but rather to just tweak it, to become an accepted part of the status quo. And like his namesake Martin Luther, he didn't want to start anything new. He just wanted to fix what was broken. And to that extent, King and the civil rights movement that he headed, they did manage to gain civil and legal protections for African Americans. He was a successful reformer. But it wasn't until after these reforms were put in place that King realized he needed to be more. It wasn't enough just to have laws in place. They were essential, they were needed, but they weren't enough. And this is when King became a revolutionary. He came to recognize that network of mutuality of which we often hear about. He came to realize that gaining equality in a country that routinely and without apology used violence against the poor of countries both near and far does not serve the larger goal of justice and peace. In a speech called Beyond Vietnam on April 4th, 1967, King makes the point that his commitment to non-violence calls him to speak against the war in Vietnam and all wars of oppression and colonization. And in that speech, King quotes Buddhist leaders of Vietnam who state the problem very clearly. They said, "Each day the war goes on, the hatred increases in the hearts of the Vietnamese and in the hearts of those of humanitarian instinct. The Americans are forcing even their friends into becoming their enemies. It is curious that the Americans, who calculate so carefully the possibilities of military victory, do not realize that in the process they are incurring deep psychological and political defeat. The image of America will never again be the image of revolution, freedom, and democracy, but the image of violence and militarism." 50 damn years later, we have not learned those same lessons. Change the name Vietnamese to about any other country in the Middle East. And it still stands true. And it was about that same time, 67, and into 1968, that King began to promote what he called the Poor People's Campaign, the true revolution. Our only hope, he said, lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, he said, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust mores, and thereby speed the day when every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low. The crooked shall be made straight, and the rough places plain. Where the civil rights movement was a desire for equality under the law, King's opposition to the war and his support for the Poor People's Campaign came out of a desire for freedom in fact, not just under the law. He came to understand that there could be no real and substantial change made in the world until we addressed the economic reality that served to constrain ideas of justice and equality to the material plane alone. A young Marian Wright Edelman had mentioned to King how she had taken a young Senator Robert Kennedy to Mississippi to meet some of America's poorest citizens face to face. She told King how this affected Kennedy so deeply, and that King knew from this what he had to do. So on December 4th, 1967, he announced the Poor People's Campaign, which he defined as a militant, nonviolent action designed to petition the government for real and specific reforms to help America's poor. Not the poor black people, not just the poor white people, not just the poor of this and that, but all the poor. It was no longer just a reformer. He was creating a revolution and uniting the people under one banner of freedom. So he and the Southern Christian Leadership Council, they reached out to Appalachian whites, to Native Americans, to Mexicans, and all other groups of poor and the disenfranchised. And he wanted to bring them all to Washington to put a face on America's poverty problem. And the plan was to disrupt the daily functions of Washington, D.C. by staging sit-ins and other nonviolent acts, that is the militant and the nonviolent. And they would do this until Congress took real and measurable action to change the status quo. Now, on March 31st, 1968, in what would be his last Sunday sermon, speaking at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., this less than 1 month before the Poor People's Campaign was scheduled to begin. I'll let you do all the math on the timing there and what happened in between and why. In that speech, King noted that poverty was nothing new, but modern times and technologies gave us the resources and techniques to do something about it. And he said the real question is whether we have the will. In a few weeks, some of us are coming to Washington to see if the will is still alive or if it is alive in this nation. The campaign did happen in spite of King's assassination. But without his direct leadership and a number of other unpredictable issues, the campaign did not have the desired impact. It did not have the strength to continue on and on as necessary. But according to historian Gordon Mantler, it did have a profound effect on many of the people who participated. He writes, whether they went for months, weeks, or just a day or two, many marchers left Washington enlightened, if not transformed. And you do not need me to remind you, 50 years later, while the names have changed, the story has not. Listening and reading some of King's latest speeches and writings this week, his prophetic vision has proven true. And until we address the underlying economic reality that supports the status quo, nothing of any significance will change. Some might say that we need a new Martin Luther King to save us, some new leader to take us into the promised land of peace and prosperity. But I disagree. The last thing we need is another Savior, another Messiah to be sacrificed at the altar of public acclaim, only to end up as yet another statue and a holiday used to undergird the legitimacy of the status quo. I agree with Cornel West, who wrote in his recent article called "America is Spiritually Bankrupt, We Must Fight Back Together," while making the point that our entire political system, including both major political parties, which, as he puts it, are both beholden to big money and big military. He notes that while one party grabs for power by the scapegoating of vulnerable people of color, LGBTQ folk, immigrants, Muslims, and women, the other party benefits by the clever deployment of peoples of color, LGBTQ peoples, immigrants, Muslims, and women to hide and conceal the lies and crimes of neoliberal policies here and abroad. More directly, he believes the neo-fascist stirrings we see today are the flip side of the neoliberal coin of the recent past. And he says, our last and only hope is prophetic fight back, a moral and spiritual awakening that puts a premium on courageous truth-telling and exemplary action by individuals and communities. Individuals and communities. Our hope, my friend, lies in people like you and me, period. Not in any politician or party or political movement. West points out the movement for Black lives is a sign of hope. He says it's an exemplary collective effort, to put prophetic fight back into our bleak moment of imperial meltdown and spiritual blackout. The prophetic vision and social analysis of the movement for Black lives begin with the most vulnerable, such as the precious LGBTQ people subject to massive trauma and terror. And in this way, he continues, the terror and trauma suffered by the people of Gaza, Iraq, Pakistan, Yemen, and India are inseparable from the trauma and terror of Baltimore, Ferguson, Oakland, and Chicago. And to this he adds the women's marches of the past few years, the mobilization of the native peoples at Standing Rock, and now the new Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend William Barber, as signs of hope for the future. Yes, the Poor People's Campaign is back. It has returned. And in their own words, it is a national call for moral revival, uniting tens of thousands of people across the country to challenge the evils of systemic racism, poverty, the war economy, ecological devastation, and the nation's distorted morality. The campaign, like the original, is rooted in nonviolence and is meant to bring unity where others would sow division. It is rooted not in government or business, but in community, and actively supports grassroots leadership and participation. It is about people and communities. Most importantly, it recognizes that all forms of oppression are linked, and so our fight against oppression must be linked. If we support freedom and liberty and justice for women, it is tied forever to the freedom, liberty, and justice of African Americans, LGBTQ, Native Americans, and all peoples of the world. There is no separation. In 1966, down in Hollywood, Florida, Dr. Martin Luther King delivered the annual Ware Lecture at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly. And in that speech, King encourages us to remain awake through the revolution. And he points out most revolutions in the past have been based on hope and hate, with the rising expectations of the revolutionaries implemented by hate for the perpetrators of the unjust system in the old order. I think the different thing about the revolution is that it has maintained the hope element, and at the same time it has added the dimension of love. It is not enough for us to speak out against those we disagree with, to call them names, post funny signs. Look at them, look how silly. We must do the much harder, much more difficult, but much more transformative thing of reaching out, finding common ground, finding a way to love those we disagree with the most. Without that, we are just following suit, and it will not be a true revolution. Do we want to just reform our current system, or do we want to turn it, to make a turn? Is it a reformation or a revolution? I was surprised. What struck me in reading this week and listening to Dr. King, how many times he used that word revolution, and how often it is not used when we talk about him. It's time for a revolution. And he reminds us that morality cannot be legislated. As we know, morality cannot be legislated. And though those laws of the vulnerable, to protect the vulnerable, are necessary, they are not sufficient. And he says, I believe firmly that our world is in dire need of a new organization. He called it the International Association for the Advancements of Creative Maladjustment. Men and women as maladjusted as the prophet Amos, who in the midst of the injustice of his day cried out in words that echo across the centuries, let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. To have a revolution, we must remain maladjusted to the world as it is. And only love is strong enough to keep us both maladjusted and actively working for justice in the world. The world is divided by hate and fear, so we must learn to stand together, recognizing the unity of all people and all creation. Because only in unity, the unity found in love and compassion, can we hope to keep alive the prophetic vision of Amos, Jesus, and King. So be it. Amen. Blessed be.